For the past almost 2 years, a task force of this committee, a bipartisan task force, had a series of hearings where we investigated, reviewed, debated, and ultimately put together some bipartisan legislation that passed the House of Representatives recently. It's now sitting over in the Senate. We investigated how to deny resources, specifically cash, to international terrorist organizations that want to kill Americans and kill citizens of our allies. And as we've heard many times during the course of those hearings and even here today, cash is it's the preferred currency of terrorism. So imagine our surprise in the middle of that 2-year investigation that we find out that the United States government, in negotiating with the Islamic Republic of Iran, reaches a settlement that provides $400 million to be delivered in the middle of the night to Iran in cash. It was the first payment. I haven't heard a lot about the second. I guess the second payment was the interest that the taxpayers paid, maybe $1.3 billion. Is there any indication as to how those second payments were made? Were they also made in cash? Any of the panelists that may wish to comment?
Yes. The Wall Street Journal reported that it was made in cash, and administration officials have confirmed that. It sounded like the same kind of financial scheme where it was wire transferred to a central bank in Europe, withdrawn, and then provided to the Iranians, and then again flown on an Iranian plane to, presumably to Iran, or perhaps it stopped in Damascus or Beirut to give money to Assad or Hezbollah. One doesn't know.
Mr. Dubowitz, do you know on what airline the cash, at least the initial cash, was delivered to Tehran?
So again, the Wall Street Journal reported that the money was picked up by an Iran Air plane, which is controlled by the Revolutionary Guards, was designated in 2011 because it was controlled by the IRGC, and regularly flies routes from an IRGC resupply base in Abadan, Iran, to Damascus and on to Beirut. So good plane to use if you want to send that cash to Hezbollah or Assad.
You know, one of the more frustrating things with the previous panel is with all the government witnesses from Department of Treasury, Department of State, Department of Justice, nobody could tell us who specifically requested that the delivery be made in cash. Was it a condition of Iran? Was it a suggestion of the United States government? Is there any open source information out there as to how that decision was made, or light that you can provide to us so that we can get that information back?
So Mr. Backemeyer said that the reason they used cash is because they needed an immediate payment. Now, presumably the Iranians demanded an immediate payment if they were going to release the hostages. And he suggested that the only immediate payment that they could actually think of was cash. And what I've tried to suggest in my testimony is that there are other ways to transfer money immediately. It's an electronic transfer that takes a millisecond and that could hit the Central Bank of Iran's account in Switzerland. Now, as Mr. Rubin said, you want to use the formal financial system because the Swiss central bank is not going to give the Iranians hundreds of millions of dollars without knowing who the end beneficiary of that transaction is. And so it's good to keep things in the formal financial system. It provides transparency and checks and balances against money laundering and terror financing. And that's precisely why the Iranians don't want the money in the formal financial system. They want it in cold cash that they can then ship to Hezbollah, to Assad, and to their other surrogates.
If I may, sir, according to reporting in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, the negotiations to release the hostages culminated around Christmas time in 2015 with this idea of a swap between the hostages that Iran held and many Iranian-American and Iranian prisoners who had been found guilty of trying to smuggle nuclear parts and other prohibited components. At that point in time, the Iranians demanded an additional $400 million. And to put it simply, they were utilizing there as leverage the desire, the overwhelming desire of the administration to come back with an agreement. I mean, simply put, if we don't want to call it a ransom, we can call it a bribe in order to maintain, figuratively, in order to maintain the notion that this agreement was working.
Yeah, Mr. Lorber, you suggested that there were other ways you could have structured the payments to essentially outmaneuver Iran. What
Exactly. So going to the question of immediacy, we actually had a mechanism set up to provide Iran with funds. Under the JPOA, the precursor to the JCPOA, there was a humanitarian finance channel that had been specifically set up to allow foreign financial institutions to give funds, wire transfer funds, directly into Iran for that purpose. And so the argument that it needed to be in cash for immediacy purposes, I don't think holds that much water.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from